Sheila, you can start.
Yes, well, next to me I have Jason Porthouse, who you will be familiar with already because he's been one of our doorstops. But in actual fact, Jason is a great friend of the symposium, been with us for several years, has spoken here a couple of times, leads the meditation for us. He works as a film editor. What else can I say about you, Jason? That's quite a bit. Yeah, that's about it, really. Yeah. But he's lovely, isn't he? Ooh.
Right, Jason Porthouse. Big round of applause. Right up. Now, bookending the chairs, we have beards and ponytails at both ends. So we have another beard and ponytail here in the shape of our good friend, Mr. Richard Smith, who some of you this morning would have seen very, very interestingly opening the proceedings. So Richard has been a lens maker over the years, co-founder of the Parallel Community with Hamish Miller, and been involved with crop circle research and many other things. So please, Richard Smith.
And our next speaker this evening is Helen Sewell. Helen also has spoken at the symposium because she is an astrologer, and she talks about the astrology of 2012. Helen also works, I believe, as a marriage guidance counsellor, so if you're having any problems. So ladies and gentlemen, please give a very warm welcome to Helen Sewell.
Now, the good lady we have here is somebody who, if you're going to be here tomorrow evening, will be even more familiar to you by the end of that. Christine Page is a lady who has spoken for us several times over the years, and she's very much involved with trying to combine alternative medicine with normal medicine and science and consciousness and bridging these divides, and has written many, many books and spoken all over the world about this. And of course, tomorrow evening we will be hearing much more from Christine. But for now, a big round for Christine Page.
And our final speaker in the middle there, with the beard, is Palden Jenkins, and he's been involved with the symposium for years and years and years. He's a writer, most recently has written Healing the Hurts of Nations, which is kind of does what it says on the tin. He spends quite a bit of time going out to Palestine, and he works with a school there, the Hope Flowers School, which is focuses a lot on healing the hurts of the children and the families that are living in Palestine. And he's also an astrologer. So we're well covered for astrology tonight, Andy.
I think so. Mr. Palden Jenkins.
Yes. Palden.
Now, here's how this is going to work. Hopefully one of you will put up a hand wanting to say something. We will do it inside, so we'll start with one side, and then when we come to the next question, it will be the other side. If we could please ask you not to speak until you're holding a microphone. If your microphone's shy, I apologise, but otherwise we won't be able to record it, and they will be answering a blank. So that's how it's going to work. So do we have a first question? Oh, we'll start with this side. Here we are. Do we have a first question? There we are, immediately.
Hello, I have a question for the panel. This morning we had a wonderful lecture from Marcus about technology of ancient Egypt. And I'm not going to ask you a question about the mystery of what or how the rocks were carved, but I'd be very interested to hear your perspective about the fact that we heard from Marcus that almost everywhere in the world there was this common theme of wonderful granite structures, whether they were pyramids or temples. And I wanted to ask you, do you think that perhaps there was a culture, a global culture, around that time that produced these great structures? And perhaps what was that culture like, do you think? And why don't we know more about it? That's my question. I would have liked to have asked Marcus, but now I'm asking you.
Any responses?
I was going to say, you could start us off with an easy one. Yeah. Warm us up gently.
Yeah.
Palden, you look like...
Yeah, Palden. I like that one. Palden.
Hello.
Come on, Palden. Off you go.
I'm not sure if there will have been a global culture as such, but that's not to say that there wasn't exchange of information and knowledge between people at every stage in the world's history. And one of the interesting things actually is that the extent of world travel and interchange in ancient times was in some respects much greater than what we had in the more recent historical period. And in a manner of speaking, we've only really achieved that same amount of global interaction in the last 100 years or so as we had in ancient times. And so I think the answer to your question is both yes and no, in as much as different cultures will always be affected by the specific environment in which they sit, and a temperate forest culture will always be rather different from a hot desert culture, and the way that they see life, the way that they perceive things. The Chinese would look on the Great Ocean as eastwards, and the Europeans would look on the Great Ocean as westwards, and what oceans symbolize to those different cultures. But on the other hand, I think there has always been a sort of an interchange between people. But I think also one other question you will have perhaps been feeling your way into is this really comes down to the origins of humanity. I myself am one of those who believes that humanity has been seeded from outside. By a mixture of seeding from outside and Darwinian evolutionary processes. And from this viewpoint, there are universal forms of knowledge. And we've heard about them in the crop circle business, such things as the knowledge of the golden mean, phi ratio, these kinds of things, which seem to have been universal amongst all cultures. And so really we're touching now into where did humanity begin with its knowledge. And we have these problems to resolve which lie in, for example, in ancient Egypt, where a lot of the building technology of the ancient Egyptians was at its peak at the beginning, and then it declined as time went on. And this points to a different worldview from the archaeological worldview, which says we all started in apes and we all grew up and we were nomads, and then we started in villages and then we went into towns and then we became the superior beings that we are now. And then there's the other viewpoint, which in this country John Michel, I think, was very important in setting in motion this kind of worldview, which is that somewhere there was knowledge which humanity started with at a very, very early stage, and we have been losing it progressively as we go on. And so just to circumambulate around your question, I think the answer to this is there have been commonalities in the sourcing of our knowledge deep in our history, and there is also knowledge which I think it can be expected that different cultures will come upon similar kinds of knowledge independently, because genius doesn't just happen in one place. And it's very, very common, in fact, for two people to come upon an idea at the same time in thoroughly separate places. In other words, if an idea is due to bubble up in human consciousness, someone will bubble it up somewhere, and it can happen in various different places. And then there's the third, which is that international travel and cultural transplantation, I think, has happened a lot in ancient times. And therefore, in answer to your question, it's a mixture of all of these kinds of things. And I think this area of coming to understand our origins, where did human knowledge and culture come from, how did we all start, is one of the frontier areas of the 21st century. And it has total bearing upon our future. My friend Sig Lundgren, who lives up the hill here, used to quote a lovely quote, and he said, "We do not seek to emulate the ancient ones, we seek what they sought."
Could I just add to that? Is the microphone on? Yeah. Okay. I don't know much about Egypt specifically, but one thing that is quite exciting is, and for those of you who heard John Wadsworth's talk on astrology and about Pluto, because Pluto unearths things and it sort of transforms things. It brings things up out of the depths. And whatever sign it's transiting through, it brings that up to be acknowledged. And I think one of the things that Capricorn rules is history and ancient history. And I think we're going to see a lot more unearthing of ancient mysteries with Pluto in Capricorn. It will stay in Capricorn now for the next 13 years. So this is quite an exciting time for anything to do with ancient knowledge and wisdom.
Okay, thank you. Do we have a question on this side? We do.
I believe this question is mostly for Richard on parallel community. And I believe you said it's been operating now for several years. How do you govern it? In other words, people still have egos and have different perceptions about things. How do you sustain a collective peace, and how do you bargain through those situations?
Well, with extreme difficulty, actually. The parallel community was started at the end of 2006, and as everybody knows, I think Hamish passed over in January last year. It's very, very difficult. When we put the website up, it was effectively, I think, hijacked or over-dominated, I think would probably be the right expression, by several people who just used it as a platform to vent their spleen, quite frankly. So it's an extremely difficult thing, because the entire concept was for those people who really didn't want to support the status quo, or who felt completely cast out, that their vote didn't matter, their opinions didn't matter. So the objective was to establish some kind of umbrella organisation where those people could actually gather and, if you like, have a voice and a representation. That was the original motivation. And of course, it will always become what people choose to make it. It was never the idea that there would be, if you like, heavy-handed management, direction. It was always reliant on the contribution of the people who felt that way. And that's incredibly tough, actually, because those are the very people that are not the ones that tend to stand up and say, this is what I think we should do. And if you introduce an overtly political angle to something like this, you appear to be dead in the water. So the original concept, I think, was absolutely fantastic, and it will obviously take, I think, a long, long time to really effectively establish. But time will tell. Does that answer your question?
Right, over to you then.
Oh dear. Any questions here? There must be someone else. We're finished for the evening.
Lady over there.
Don't be bashful for this side, folks.
Hello, Symposium. I'm new to Symposium. Hello. I wanted to ask a question regarding the lectures I've seen today. We're talking about change in advance of whatever's going to happen in December 2012. And I want to sort of ask the panel whether it's actually that change is going to happen, that we see change coming up, or is it the fact that the group collected here today, and probably the wider group that couldn't make it today, actually want to see change happen? Yeah.
Okay, can we have a response? Thank you, Richard.
Okay, I think, as I mentioned this morning, I think that change is going to happen in 2012 for the very simple reason that around about the 21st of December, I think that the enormous collective and expectancy is going to be so colossal. Something's going to happen, you know. I think it's the old situation where you gather so many people, the energy developed is so enormous, and then you're going to wake up to cornflakes and egg and bacon the following morning, and it'll be the 22nd of December. Okay, so I think change will happen in 2012 simply for that original reason. But the second part, I think, of the question that you're really getting to, there absolutely is. I think the collective elevation of awareness, if you like, is palpable. That said, it's not a universal thing. I mean, I have asked people, you know, what do you think of the changes that are taking place? And they look at me and say, well, what the hell are you talking about? Right, so it isn't universal. It really isn't. So I think change will happen in 2012. I don't think we're going to see any kind of catastrophe, because why should we? And why should we call that down on ourselves anyway? We're not that stupid, I hope. So I think 2012, something's going to happen for definite, because I think we will it.
I agree. Thank you for what you're saying there. This has been a subject that I've been talking about for a few years now. And I have traveled the world asking many of the indigenous people who truly say something's going to happen. This is what they've been waiting for. However, none of them are prepared to say what they think is going to happen. Of course, the Maya are very upset because they said, we'll just make another damn calendar. You know, what is your problem? So they are very upset by the 2012 film and other things that are being said. It's like, why are we being hijacked? We're not the only people speaking about this. They also speak about 2012 just being a beginning, and 2023 coming up to the end of that Pluto in Capricorn, and then 2038. So they've kind of pushed their dates back a bit, so that I think it's a bit like I say, it's like bringing your baby home. You know, you've done the labor, you bring it home in 2012, you go, there, that's finished now. And anybody who's had a child knows that's just the beginning. And I think that 2012 is the beginning, 2023 is the middle, 2038 is the end, according to the Maya. I think the other side, and I think the question was lovely about whether or not we're bringing change on. Many cultures talk about the veils falling during this time. I'll be speaking about this tomorrow. And the veils between the dimensions are falling. I think that there can be nobody who is not aware that we know more. I mean, this whole idea of history being available to us, the future being, there is so much more available to us, which is also being mirrored by the things we see in the world. And I, many years ago, had a meditation when I said, wow, wouldn't everybody want to know themselves in their fullness? Why isn't that what we all want? We want to say, that's who I am, who's been waiting for. And I was told that when that happens, 40% of people will immediately fall asleep because they can't deal with knowing who they are, and they can't deal with choice because they're much happier when they follow somebody else. 40% of people will immediately recreate what has just been swept away. And 15% will get confused, will actually say, well, who am I? And 5% will get it. And I have to say, in all the years, I've been teaching, talk about 2012 around the world, and I see people falling asleep. They glaze over and say, well, I'm already there. I don't have to change. Or they just say, well, can I continue doing what I'm doing? So I would say I have a part of me that falls asleep. There's a part of me that recreates. I think none of us can be complacent to the fact that, do you actually want to bring change to yourself? Or is it just a head thing that we say, that would be nice as long as it doesn't disturb my life too much?
I think as well, I mean, looking at it from the perspective of outside of gatherings like this, and that, to an extent we're all more or less of a like mind here, and this might be your first symposium, but the mere fact that you're here and inquiring about these things and open-minded to it, all of us are at different stages of a journey. But out there in the big bad world of, I was going to say news of the world readers, but that's old news now, isn't it? But that kind of the people that aren't into this, who are the vast majority. I think what's interesting now is that we're seeing the veils falling in that world as much as this one, if you like, because the old order is breaking down. In our country alone, we've had things like the MP's expenses scandal, we've had the news of the world thing coming out and the whole phone hacking thing. In the news, we are seeing things that are causing people to question the old order, even if they're not into anything esoteric or metaphysical or spiritual or anything like that. They're questioning how things are and how things have been, and realising that the emperor's got no clothes in a way, you know, that what they thought was solid and dependable and something that was steadfast is actually falling away rapidly. You know, I mean, you talk to people on the street, and how many of them think that our intervention in Libya is something that's, you know, anything other than to do with oil, because it's so blatantly hypocritical now. And a lot of what's going on, I think, is kind of exposing the myths and the lies on which our society, to a large extent, is founded. And that sort of smoke screen is starting to go. So I think that actually there's probably more of an appetite, or no, not an appetite, more of an acceptance of some of these changes happening amongst people. You know, talk to, again, people that aren't necessarily into what we're into, and it's, you know, you hear snitches of conversation on a bus or something like that, and it's kind of like, UFOs, yeah, well, yeah, they probably exist, and then they don't give it another thought, you know. Diana was bumped off, yeah, probably. And, you know, so I think there is a kind of a surprising level of readiness to accept different ideas amongst people. And I think that we're seeing that process accelerating now, and we're seeing that, and that's going to just grow and grow and grow and grow and snowball, you know.
I was just going to say, you know, you're talking about waiting for change, but as far as I can see, there's been massive changes happening, and especially since Pluto went into Capricorn in 2008, the big financial crash, and you know, all the uprisings in Libya, and we're going to see an acceleration of that. Even this country won't be immune from revolution. What's going to happen with the euro and the dollar? You know, big changes. We're already seeing the changes. We're already in the period of change. And I don't think it's all going to happen on one day. But especially over the next few years, definitely. It's like as the Pluto-Uranus square builds up, and it's going to be exact, the first exact hit is going to be next summer, then that incredible clash between the two titans, of one of power and control and the collective shadow, as John said, against that revolutionary spirit of bringing on the new, and that Promethean spirit of awakening mankind, is going to accelerate.
I think to address the lady who raised this question, it's important to understand that our lives are short in terms of the movement of history. We tend to get quite restless about the movement of change. However, during my lifetime, and I'm not that ancient yet, but during my lifetime, the world's population has doubled. And the implications of this all over to human society, to the ecosystem, to the whole way in which we see everything are enormous. We will only really get to see and understand the full implications of what has gone on during my lifetime since 1950 in 200 or 300 years' time. And so one of the issues here, therefore, is a matter of perspective. We've got to look back, because things are changing enormously fast at the moment. And the way in which history really moves is quite surreptitious. I'll give you an example. Here's a little bit of astro speak again. One of the big events of recent history, and by that I'm talking centuries now, was around 1892, and it was a conjunction of Neptune and Pluto. And those of you who study history, you think 1892, well, 1892 is not an outstanding time in history in terms of events. There weren't many things going on. But wait, hang on. There were people tinkering in back workshops, in back streets, inventing the motor car. There were people who were developing the aeroplane, and the big developmental problem they had in 1892 was that all of the flight engineers were getting killed in all the mistakes they were making. So it took until 1902 for the first proper flight to take place. We had the development of electrical systems. We had the development of preserved foods, such as canned foods. We had the first development of plastic. We had also we had the beginnings of the multinational corporation. We had the beginning of the transformation of colonial empires into the beginnings of a world system. And so the issue here was that all of these things were happening in the background as far as people who were alive in 1892 were concerned. They weren't aware of Daimler and Benz developing the motor engine, and they weren't aware that the motor engine was going to be important. They didn't even really think that we would be flying around in jumbo jets in less than 100 years from that time. Do you see what I'm saying? In other words, the big history that is happening at the moment is happening very much under the surface in many ways, and it's happening in our consciousnesses as well. Give you one example. You know, I've been battling away on a rather fruitless battle for peace ever since the 1960s. I was one of the LSE students, you know, in the late 60s. And in some respects, it's been a fruitless battle. And nowadays, I work in Palestine, where basically, if you want to make any progress, my recommendation is don't work in Palestine, right? Because there's a much deeper process going on here. And what is it? It is that peace in the world is not anymore a moral imperative. It's not an ideal anymore. It's a practical reality which we have to get to grips with, because if we do not create peace in a non-military sense and all this kind of thing, then we cannot cooperate on planet Earth, and we will not survive the crisis that we are already in, because we have to cooperate our way through it. So such a thing as peace, which was an ideal in the late 1960s, is now a very pragmatic, practical issue, because we can't afford to carry on with that pattern. We can't afford to carry on with the idea of little nations, with the idea that we are all separate and that my interests and your interests are against one another. You know? So this is an enormous, big shift, which is actually to do with processing through thousands of years' worth of stuff. And similarly with the Mayan calendar, we're talking about a cycle which goes back to, was it 3013 BC? Something like 5,000 years, right? And in a 5,000-year cycle, 30 years is peanuts, all right? And so really, don't get hung up on December 2012, because the chances are that nothing much might actually happen apart from a load of anticipation. There's always the chance that nothing much might happen. But history is really moving at the moment. And if you think back to 3000 BC, at the time of the early megalith builders, so much has gone on since that time. And we're talking about opening a new cycle, which is going to go on to about 5,000 and something, year. And in this sense, we are living in the biggest of change. And you'd better believe it, it's really happening now, and you are a part of it. And the big question, of course, is what do I do in that? What's my contribution to make to that? And just remember also, your life is short in terms of the progression of human history. But perhaps it's also time now to reevaluate the idea that you only get one life.
We'll get that working for you one moment. Okay. Oh, good. We do have somebody this side. Okay, hold on. Here we are.
Thank you. This is a question, again, for Palden and Helen. I find it really very helpful when you illustrate events by the conjunctions of Pluto or transiting Capricorn and what to expect. So what I'd like to know for us over the next, 10 years, 20 years, 5 years, what is happening in the skies, and what's your feeling about what that might bring for us as people, us as a planet, nations, please?
Well, there's kind of two main things that are going on, I think. And you've got the Uranus-Pluto, which is very kind of dynamic and transformative. So we've got all that revolutionary energy, and That also covers new technology as well. And now Uranus, the planet to do with new technology, has gone into Aries. I think we're going to see an acceleration very much in that regard. And if you can only picture the future in terms of new technology, I think it's going to take mankind on hugely. So we've got that side. But there's also another side, which is to do with Neptune, the planet of oneness and that feeling of longing to belong to the source. And that has come home now after 165 years. And in a way, I think there's going to be a lot more sort of leap forward in terms of psychic ability and being able to feel that we can communicate without the new technology as well. And I think we'll hear a little bit more about that tomorrow, is it? From a speaker that has done some investigations in sort of psychic studies in the future. But yeah, there's like this sort of two movements in a way of like this push forward. I just feel it's like the birth pangs, as you were saying, Christine. It's like we're struggling to come to a new place, and I think that most people can feel that change going on at the moment. But they're the main pushes that are going to take us through, I think.
Thank you. Can I take over from? I just wanted to bring up, your wonderful example of what has happened in the past and the future. One other thing that's happening is us coming to the end of the Piscean age. And I have recently been looking at the idea of whether or not there's a dominance of the patriarchy versus the matriarchy. That's what I've been looking at. And I thought, really the Piscean age, which started 2011 years ago, we would suggest, had nothing to do with patriarchy or matriarchy. In fact, it was to do with love thy neighbor as thyself. It was to do with oneness. It was the very oneness that Neptune going into Pisces is bringing us. And I would suggest that over 2,000 years, we've actually hated everybody who was not like us. We have done the exact opposite. And the other thing we've done is we've looked for a guru or a teacher or a master to tell us what to do. And I feel the greatest challenge we have for change is to be accountable for our actions, to take responsibility for our actions, to actually even know that we have choice. And I feel that that's what is... I feel that with the Uranus going into Aries, the revolutions, what I was shown was that first of all, we'll attack the leaders because they must be the problem. And we're seeing a lot of that happening. We're all going to attack everybody who's told us what to do. And then the leaders will turn around to us and say, well, if you think you can do a better job, get on with it. And we'll say, well, who else will step up as a leader? We'd really like someone to do it for us so that we can blame them later on. So I see a falling over the next 90 years of this obsession we have with seeking somebody else who we can put up on a pedestal and then pull down when we don't like them. And really, the anarchy and the revolution is, are we willing to stand up in who we are as individuals so that we can enter the Aquarian age, which is about self-consciousness and each individual being unique in the contribution they bring to the world at this time.
Calendar business applies to the Mayans. It always has, and I think it always will. I'm not so sure if it's a global issue. That's the stuff of Europeans and Americans and our fantasies and projections and all this kind of thing. But speaking astrologically, one of the interesting things that people like ourselves have been participating in is we have been going through a period of rising waves. The first one was this time, the 1890s that I was mentioning, which was a beginning of the new communications technologies which have facilitated the globalization process. The second wave was the mid-1960s, which was a rise of a new spiritual impulse, the rise of ecological thinking, new health thinking that Christine has been very involved with, a new sense of human rights, and again, Marshall McLuhan's idea of the global village, which was a new stage in the globalization process. Then the next one was the Uranus-Neptune conjunction of 1993. And 1993 was one of those years where all of us astrologers were sitting around thinking, what's going to happen, what's going to happen? And in a way, it was very, very quiet. But what happened was the birth of the internet. Right? And that is a process which is still only unfolding. The full effects of it are still only unfolding. But the general drift of all of these things is about this word, which in the last few decades has become a rather dirty word. It's about globalization. But the thing is that what's happening here is that we're going through this enormous evolutionary step, which is that no longer are we separate people on planet Earth. To get through this next one, we've got to do it as one planetary race. And the ultimate issue behind this, once we've sorted ourselves out and saved ourselves from our own self-created disaster, the next step beyond this is to meet the neighbors. And we've got to do this as one planetary race, right? This is where it's all gone wrong with all the E.T. story in recent times. You know, take me to your leader and everything. Well, our leader has been people like the President of the United States and stuff in the last few decades. And I'm sorry, but this is not the human race. You know, he's not a representative of the human race. So in order for us to meet the neighbors without ourselves getting planed out in the ways that happened when, for example, Europeans spread around the world and started meeting with indigenous cultures and wiped them out with disease, with cultural influence, with violence, and all of these kinds of things. In order for this to happen, we as a human race have to reach a stage of inherent equality with our neighbors. Otherwise, we're going to get wiped out even if they're meeting us on compassionate terms. Right? And this is the big breakthrough that we're in now, the big historical thing, back to this lady here. The big one is we are really having to resolve this question that we are on one planet, one small planet, and we are one race of people. We might think we have differences, and we do within a certain frame of reference, but basically we're all two-legged critters with the same basic need for food, space, a decent life, and to get on with our neighbors. And this is the big breakthrough now. It's about justice, it's about ecological rebalancing, it's about creating a sane world. And so just to go forward into the future, astrologically, from an astrological viewpoint, actually 2012 isn't a major thing. It's a critical issue. It's the breaking of a wave, but I'd look at 2048. Most of us in this room won't be alive at this time, in this life at least. But I would suggest to you that really what we're coming to around this time of 2012-ish is an opening of the curtains where people on planet Earth have to really realize what's really going on and what we really need to do. And we've known this for 40-ish years, but the whole population of planet Earth needs to get straight on this one. Then this starts a new agenda of a whole load of work to do, and we get to a critical point sometime in the future, and I'd suggest it might be around 2048, which is where all of the criticals, demographic, climatic, resource-related, all of these things reach a very critical level, and we're at crunch point. We're not there yet. We know it. We're not there yet. We yet are to reach crunch point, and we've got to do it right. And that's what I'd suggest is coming in a few decades' time. And I'd also, just to take it really further on into fantasy land, and, you know, but I'd suggest that, you know, those of us who've dreamt of a new age, of a new world, I think it could well be possible by the end of this century, the beginnings of that new world. And one of the characteristics of it is that humanity recognizes that we are one family living on one planet in cooperation with our planet and in cooperation with each other. That's an enormous evolutionary breakthrough.
Sorry about that. It should work.
I would actually agree with Palden, although we disagree by 1 year. This morning I thought 2047 was going to be where we were going to peak. We won't argue about 1 year. I think the challenge, as I mentioned this morning, that the viewing history either in events and personality mode or in wave mode, motion if you like, this will be looked upon as the technological challenge, if you like, rather as the Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution. As Palden says, the 1890s was an extraordinary time of pre-invention almost of what we see today. The enormous speed, and we really haven't seen a thing yet. We absolutely have no conception, no imagination as to just how fast this is going to become. And in 2047, the prediction of a population of, or 2050, a prediction of a population of 9 billion, whereas today we're looking at, 6.75 billion. The world population doubled every 40 years from the French Revolution onwards, and then it gathered speed. I'm a couple of months younger than Palden, that's all, but the changes have been enormous. They will develop. I believe this period will be looked back on as the incredibly quick technological age. We are faced with massive challenges, political challenges as well. The exportation of democracy a la USA is not internationally acceptable. It will solve nothing. We have problems in Pakistan, Afghanistan, India, places like this, with huge populations that are simply, it's not being addressed on a correct basis. And I think Palden's quite right. You can't, the President of the United States, I'm sorry, does not talk for humanity. When we all realize that we are one grain of sand on the beach and the world actually doesn't really revolve around each one of us, then we begin to crack it. And unless we do that, we are sunk. Because each one of us cannot hoe our own road. It is, as Disraeli said, you never get up the greasy pole on your own. You need help from other people. Now, in some countries, when people say, well, what would you do? If I gave you two options, what would you do? For example, in Pakistan, they would say, find yourself a hilltop and fortify it, and then join a good regiment. Why? Because the Pakistan army is the only institution that works in that country. And yet it's supposed to be a democratic operation. So the challenges are huge. I believe, looking back on it, it will be a technological thing, but you haven't begun to imagine how it's going to be.
Has that gone as well? 1, 2, 1, 2. There we go. Can you hear me okay? This whole sort of flowering of the technological age, I was just thinking, Andy and Helen and Richard and I were talking last night. Most of you have got a mobile phone, a smartphone, and right now on this I can connect to a live blog from somebody in Syria, in Libya, who's blogging about their experience, somebody that's a climate activist somewhere. That sort of connectivity that's only just starting, and this technology is in its absolute infancy. And breathe out. That it is really in its infancy. You know, it is a case of we ain't seen nothing yet. You know, and I'm not somebody that thinks technology is going to save us, but it is kind of a proto-collective consciousness, if you like. We talk about it as a kind of spiritual development, and that eventually we'll acquire, you know, more and more telepathic gifts and have that feeling of. But this is the kind of start of it in many ways, because what it's doing, other than enabling us to do that, is it's starting the awareness process. You know, and so people unconsciously of any kind of spiritual development are starting to get a far greater appreciation of a global unity. You know, how many people, kids on Facebook have got, 500 friends that can be anywhere. There's no geographical location for them now. They've, it's pen pals gone mad, isn't it? You know, whereas we don't write with quill pens anymore and expect to get 3 letters a year. It's instant. And you can Skype your friends on the other side of the world. And so this technological advance, which is going to accelerate in a way that sometimes scares me, because I can remember a time when there wasn't an internet and there weren't mobile phones, and answer phones were kind of like the height of technology, and you'd send faxes to people, and maybe you had a pager if you were very, very sort of cutting edge. You know, that's 15 years ago. And look what's happened in the meantime. You know, we were saying last night, there are kids that have grown up who haven't known a pre-internet age, you know, who've never had that concept of kind of, you know, and what really scares me is I'm an old vinyl junkie, you know, I like my 12-inch LPs, you know, and CDs are kind of like, I let them in the house grudgingly, but it's convenient. And you've got people who kind of look at CDs now and go, what's that? You know, we just download. So it's just another illustration of the fact that, you know, the technology is going to enable this consciousness, group consciousness, to start to happen. So even if, as some people have talked about, I know Peter Taylor and other people have talked about the idea of a solar flare wiping out the internet in a trice, along with a lot of other things as well. Yes, that could happen, but what it doesn't wipe out is the change in the consciousness that's happened up here. And it might be a case of finding another way to reroute that communication. But that change has happened, and that genie's out of the bottle, and it ain't ever going back again. So again, it's the start of this process, I think.
And all this talk of new technology, can I just apologise for the sound? We're just getting the basics working here.
You're
and
just
we
keeping the crowd
apologise that we lost the projector as well, but hopefully the big bits will come back up there in a minute after a bit of fiddling. So I do apologise, bear with us. Okay.
We have a question here.
Yeah.
Hello. If I could address...
Just keeping the crowd alert, right?
If I could address the gentleman with the camera, when you're ready. You mentioned earlier that you have your own thoughts about how the human race was seeded, and I wondered if you would care to expand upon those thoughts.
That is interesting. That is an interesting question. It was actually the subject of, I think it was my first talk at the symposium in 1992.
Share with green one, pal.
We're going to be one big knot of spaghetti.
The evolution of technology.
Yeah.
It goes back really to the reason why we're all here. And what I understand about all this is that planet Earth was set up as a big experiment to hybridize a new kind of soul, which was experimenting with the possibility of working with a deeper level of physical density than had ever been achieved before by conscious, soul-driven beings. And so what they did was they started preparing this world, which was already evolving in its way, but rather like wild gardening, they let natural processes take their course, but they did strategic interventions at various different times in order to accelerate certain processes and to move things in certain ways, in order to prepare this planet for a race or a kind of physically incarnated, advanced, soul-driven beings. And I think there were probably several failed attempts that came along, and various experiments which didn't quite go right, and all this kind of thing. But basically, I think this is the way that things developed here on planet Earth, by this mixture of evolution and intervention. Just as you would as a gardener, you might do things like grafting of species. You might do things like feeding the soil in certain kinds of ways in order to create certain kinds of outcomes. You might do things like developing certain microclimates in part of your garden in order to provide an environment in which certain things can unfold. You know, that kind of thing. But working with natural processes too. And seen in this light, I think this is what happened, and I think there was an overriding bunch of people from somewhere who were mainly in charge of this, but I think there were also lots of other groups of beings who joined in, both on an official and an unofficial level, with some levels of piracy and sneak intervention and all sorts of things involved too. And this is how we have quite a universal record across the planet of different cultures and peoples who have stories of their origins coming from the stars. And those stories are quite different. And one of the characteristics of all this is that we are, I think this is probably one of the things from a kind of an ET cosmological viewpoint, which is very, very distinctive and special about living on planet Earth. It's one of our greatest assets and one of our greatest problems, which is that in many worlds, a tribe or a nation or a world of souls will grow up together, they will co-evolve together as one people. But this one was basically a whole bunch of volunteers who were called in from every bloody whichwhere. And we all came in and we went on an orientation course, and they said it was going to be very difficult, and we said, yeah, we'll handle it. And they said, no, it's going to be very, very, very difficult. And we said, yeah, we'll handle it. And they said, all right, well, we'll give it a go. And so we started coming in as souls, just gradually, incrementally, and now we're coming in at a rate of knots. You know, for the population of planet Earth to rise by billions, it can only really mean the importation of new souls into planet Earth. And so we have this rather interesting situation now where you could possibly say that that representatives from the whole universe are now here. And this is one of the explanations of the sheer depth of our variety. It's not just about races and cultures and this kind of thing. It's because we're coming from very, very different places, and our soul backgrounds, you could say, are very, very different. Very fundamentally different. And this is one of our great assets because of our sheer biodiversity in all sorts of different ways, but it's one of our great problems because of our sheer differences between us all as well. And so this is the way I look at it, and this is the way I see the seeding of humanity as an incremental process over many millions of years and hundreds of thousands and tens of thousands of years. And we get this seeding happening now as well in the form of ideas, downloads that come. One little one that I was on the edge of was I grew up in Liverpool in the 1960s, and you had 4 particular people who, in a manner of speaking, received a download for about 5 years. And it just allowed them to just reach far beyond all of the things that had been going on before. And then, suddenly it ended. The transmission ended, and everyone's been working with the results ever since. You know? And we've had similar kinds of things, outbursts of genius that come along, someone comes along, say, Hahnemann, you know, the man who just got homeopathy. God knows where he got it from, but he got it, and he passed it down, and it's filtered out, and things have developed from that, and all the rest of it. And so human genius, human ideas are part of this seeding process too. And we're all part of this. We're part of it particularly because of our involvement with crop formations. This is part of the seeding process. This is a direct communication for those of us who get it, at least to the extent that we can. But we get it far more than we're even aware of as well. It talks to us in language which we're only as yet we don't fully understand it, but we recognize it, and the programming is going in. You know, so that's what I was talking about really in terms of, and it's not specifically just related to Anunnaki or to the Dogon or to anyone. You know, it's all of these things. There are lots of different things, and there are the spiritual paths of humanity too. You know, where the angels come down from heaven, or where the great body Dharma, you know, received teachings from the Dakinis or whatever it is. You know, there's been this both genetic and psychological download process, and we're still part of it today, I believe. If you're particularly interested, if you want to ask where did I get this, I was involved in a project with a bunch of beings called the Council of Nine, and there was a book that came out which I had the privilege of being able to compile, which was called The Only Planet of Choice, and it came out in 1993, and you can still get it on the internet. It's out of, yes, you can still get it on the internet.
Okay, do we have a question from this side? Yes, gentleman there. Hold on.
Recently in Japan, we've had that terrible atomic disaster, and I wonder what the panel thinks this may be the death knell for sort of atomic fission as our generating of power in the world.
Well, it depends on whether you think that was an accident or not. Now, I think it's a matter of reasonable record that the Japanese were going to offer the Iranians enriched uranium. That will enrage Uncle Sam. Now, I think it's true that the Iranian centrifuge computing, or the whole centrifuge network, in order for the Iranians to enrich or to start their nuclear program, which is deeply unpopular, used the Siemens control system. And I think I'm right in saying that the Japanese Fukushima plant also used the Siemens control system. Now, the Stuxnet virus was reported to have basically invaded the Iranian system and completely neutralized it, therefore buying the people who are interested in preventing this at least another year. It at least prevented the Israeli Air Force from going in and bombing the thing. Now, if that's the case, the Stuxnet virus could then, in theory, could have been used against Japan to actually stop them from selling enriched uranium to Iran. If the HARP system in North America, Greenland and Russia, I believe, that's capable apparently of 1 billion watts of playing around with the weather, that's High Altitude Aurora Research Project, if that was then capable of causing an earthquake, thereby creating a tsunami, it kind of covers the tracks. Now, Germany withdraws from the nuclear program, and they say that that will be finished by 2022. Well, if I was in charge of Germany, I'd say to the clever people that they undoubtedly have, you've got 10 years to reinvent a control system for our nuclear program which does not involve the knowledge of the North Americans. Because my personal feeling is that I think Germany said, look, we want independent control over our nuclear program, and we don't want the possibility of an outside agency infecting our control programs with computer viruses. Now, if that's true, and I really hope it isn't, we really have descended into an even bigger pit of a complete loss of any kind of ethics. Because the 9/11 deal, £15 billion to refurbish 2 tower blocks, and if someone somewhere decided that to eliminate 3,000 people to save that kind of money is morally and ethically a correct thing to do, then we really have sunk into a pit of complete rubbish. We really do need to re-examine who we are, what we are, and why we do what we do. So if you believe that the Japanese thing was an accident, then fine. But as far as the nuclear is concerned, then if you believe that fossil fuel-free technology is available and is suppressed by the corporations who, of course, run the deal, if you think that's true and that that sort of technology is available and we are simply prevented from getting it, until that is actually unearthed and until that is proven, we seem to be stuck with nuclear technology, because if you don't want it, that's fine, but the lights won't shine as things are now. So our ability to flick switches and get what we want would be severely curtailed if we don't have a nuclear program. I think the choice is that simple, but the ethics of whether Japan was actually interfered with simply because they threatened to sell enriched uranium to the Iranians, who after all are the great Satan as far as North America is concerned, and with some reason, because the Iranians have said they wish to wipe Israel off the face of the earth. That doesn't suit the Jewish lobby in North America, and it's not a very nice thing to do. And this Ahmadinejad guy is completely out of control. So that's a major problem. Have I answered that question? I'm hoping it isn't the case, because I think mankind will have sunk to a new low level, and that's a great, great shame.
One thing I was just going to add to that I think we've mentioned before tonight that these nexus points where you get these downloads of information that create massive change, and undoubtedly the whole splitting of the atom, the start of the nuclear age, was one of them. What we do with that information, whether we use it wisely or not, that's one of the great questions. And I think the idea, we tend to think of a collective consciousness and the expansion of that and the realization that we all are one as a kind of a linear thing that spreads throughout the world and links everyone that's there at the time. But it also, I believe, goes forward into the future. Do you see what I mean? It's not a flat disk that connects everybody. It's a sphere that goes forward into the future and back into the past as well. And it's that very thing that Palden talked about, our lives are short. Well, there is a tendency to short-termism. So yeah, let's make free nuclear energy and sod the fact that in 200 years' time we're going to have the mother of all problems with what to do with the waste, because that's not our problem. And I think that the true advent of collective consciousness will take the past and the future into account as well. And it doesn't just become some other generation's problem. So again, with all these things, I think the technology per se isn't necessarily the problem. It's how we react to it and how we deal with it and how we deal with it sensibly. Because if we'd have had any thought for future generations and the real ramifications of it, we'd have stopped that a long time ago. I don't know. Do I think that there are other technologies in place that will supersede it? Yes, there probably are. But until we get beyond the idea of a profit-orientated energy generation and all the rest of it, I think that is another huge issue that faces us. If these technologies exist to give free or certainly very low impact energy, and I'm not talking about solar and wind power, I'm talking about other things, how do you transition from the oil-based economy we've got to that? So I think that's a huge issue too. I don't know whether that adds anything or answers your question, but...
Can I just say, isn't it interesting that Uranus rules uranium and plutonium is ruled by Pluto, and we've got them in the most challenging aspects since nuclear power was invented? I think we've really got to watch out over the next year or so in terms of the whole nuclear thing.
Okay, thank you. Do we have a question? Oh, we do. They're ready and waiting.
Hello, and I just wanted to ask, it was mentioned earlier that the building of the pyramids and the other granite structures around the world, that they built them better originally and then they forgot. I've also heard that that nuclear weapons that might have been around hundreds of thousands of years ago. It's obvious that from a lot of sources that we have, or humankind has forgotten a lot. Has anybody got any theories on why we forgot? We have forgotten all this knowledge that we used to have hundreds of thousands of years ago.
Thank you. I would, when Palden was talking about our origins, one of the things that came to my mind is, and it was an excellent book, The Only Planet of Choice, so thank you for putting it together, was so much that we're supposed to be creative beings. And I feel that we've literally become out of touch with our own creativity, or we've almost become victims to our own creation. And some of the times when we create things, and we do it even today, when we like something we've created, we own it. When we don't like what we've owned, we say somebody else did it, or we don't take responsibility. And very much our nuclear waste, or any waste, is the shit that we've created that we would prefer to project onto somebody else. So I think that part of we're literally buried by our own creations at this time. from my medical side, it's almost as if we've all got amnesia and dementia because we are so caught up in the thoughts that will keep us away from what we created that we can't remember this new download of inspiration that's coming. I feel that, this is a planet of creativity, and I want to say that. And until we start to take ownership of what we've created, and it's very much what we're all saying here, we cannot allow ourselves to bring back to mind what it is that we've been doing. I always think it's interesting that we're fairly sure in Atlantis, or the downfall of Atlantis happened because of us harnessing the sun with crystals and other mechanisms. And when people are talking about, let's find a new fuel source, I think, well, there's a great big thing up there that we could use. And I think, isn't it interesting that we switched off our consciousness to something we've used in the past that we didn't handle well? And I feel that we have done that a lot in our amnesia, which is to remove from our memory those things that we cannot handle. And as you are hearing me say, I think it's only when we take responsibility for what we created that we will then be able to use the technology of the past.
Just one little... Well, one little footnote for me is there's one little clue here, and that is, I was rather, in a way, blessed at the beginning of my adult life because I grew up in Liverpool and I was a flower power hippie and I had the best acid on the planet and had ideal conditions in which to come to many insights. And to be honest, I've forgotten quite a few of them. And to my horror, I find myself now at this stage of life having experiences which remind me of lessons I thought I had learned, but I find that I haven't really. And so it might be that one of the answers to your question about humanity is that conditions were very good back then, say in the megalithic period or ancient Egypt. And things have been pretty difficult since in many ways, and you do forget.
I think, curiously, one of the interesting things that may have begun to interfere with all this is actually the invention of this. We stopped walking around on our own feet and we started putting shoes on, and we actually got an interface between ourselves and the planet, and that's when it started. Okay? We started to remove ourselves from the floor, literally. The other thing you have to remember, that life expectancy back then was very, very short. Travel was incredibly limited. You did what your father told you. He did what the village elder told him. The tribal elder told the village elder what to do. Society, in many respects, was extremely structured. Shamans, the line of authority was incredibly clear. And I think a lot of experience was passed down to those people who could actually handle it. So I think they were incredibly smart, no question. But as soon as we get shoes on, that's when the technology race started, and then we got so damn clever. And look where we are now. We're dependent on flicking switches for our power. As Christine says, it's up there, the sun. That's where it is. Wave power. 101 things we should have addressed a long time ago, and we simply haven't.
Okay, do we have a question from this side? We do, but we don't have a microphone yet. Hold on.
Thank you. This isn't actually a question. I just want to throw something in which I feel is important. And many of us in the room, most of us, I think, will have had lots of experiences. And to remind us that actually Earth, planet Earth, is highly intelligent and communicative. And so are all the creatures, not just human beings, but the plant kingdom, the stone kingdom, the animal kingdom, the sea, the lot. So we don't have all the answers, but the planet does. And it's trying to communicate and trying to shift things. Now then, going back to the nuclear situation at Fukushima, I expect many people here remember in the newspapers there was this event of Fukushima nuclear power station and in Scotland suffered an invasion of jellyfish that brought the stations to a close. I also saw on the internet a channeling, oh, terrible things are happening and all these jellyfish are multiplying and it's so terrible. You know, and this was just days after this fantastic achievement by the jellyfish of bringing nuclear power to a standstill. And so, of course, when I learnt that, we've had a wonderful heat wave and I've been swimming in the sea, and because of the heat wave, we've got quite a lot of jellyfish, which of course sting. But of course, I didn't get stung, but I was swimming amongst them and I was saying, good on you, good for you, thanks ever so much. Because, of course, I'm swimming in the sea, which has got this radioactivity pouring into it. But I know we're not alone, and I know the planet has an agenda, and it's her planet. So it's time that I feel that we bring into our discussions and everything. We're not the only ones. We cannot do it alone. We're part of a planet which has a terrific amount of wisdom and intelligence stored there, waiting for us. So that's just all I wanted to say, Andy. I want to have a chat with you afterwards.
Can I just add to that about our children, really? And there's one worrying thing, I think, is that it seems that the next generation seem less connected to the earth. And there is less going out. When I was young, we used to go out in the woods, be out the house a lot. And I live on Ashdown Forest, and we go out walking the dog and that kind of thing. Just don't see any children up there. And I find that quite sad. Maybe we can't stop the wheels of evolution, and maybe we are going to become more removed from the earth and more sort of... I thought it was interesting what you were saying about the shoe and being removed from the earth, because in a way it is that disconnect from the earth. And it'd be great. I know a lot of people are sort of saying, or even wishing for this sort of solar flare so that it will wipe out all electricity and we'll go back to medieval times. But I'm not sure. It just doesn't feel that that's the way evolution is going. But I think that, yeah, it's worth really connecting our children back to the earth again.
Thank you. I would like to say that the great creator, what a creatrix, also gave us a piece of earth to walk around with and look after. It's called our body. And it's got every element in it, fire, earth, air, water. And I spend years trying to get people back in their bodies, because this is not going to help. So much of our misinformation has been that you don't need a body, it's better off without one, just ascend out of it, meditate out of it. I believe that the change that is coming, we will do much better when we are in our body, on the earth, playing with the earth, loving it, and that is the way in which we will work through this. So I'd say go out in your bodies, go into your bodies, out into the earth, enjoy it. That's what will help us, I think, to go through these times.
Yeah, absolutely echo that. I think that is so true, and it's that saying that I've said once here before, you know, we're not human beings trying to be spiritual, we're spiritual beings trying to be human, and that's a very different way of looking at it. And yeah, I think we do need to be totally, you know, we all have ideas about the continuation of consciousness after what we call death, etc., maybe reincarnation, all the rest of it. But that maxim of, you know, live your life as if it's the only one you've got, because that's when you can make the greatest difference. Yes, if we absolve that responsibility now and just go, I'm just going to bliss out and, you know, do my meditations and not really engage with all these things that are going on, how's change ever going to happen? You know, we are that change. We have to live that change and we have to embody it and be at one with the planet, because sure as God made little apples, if we don't, the planet will... I don't think we will ever destroy this planet, right? I don't believe we will ever destroy it. We might destroy our ability to live on it in a physical body, but that doesn't mean the planet will die, because the timescales, the geological timescales of the planet Earth are huge, you know? And something, yes, we might damage it, but it will continue. But we might not be able to be there to see it regenerate and go on to something else. So I think, from that point of view, on a very, very long time scale, I don't worry about that. But, I think we do need to, as Christine said, just absolutely be here and really live that physical life as well.
I just want to add, thank you for that, and I was feeling what Palden had said as well, is that being in body is the only way in which we really are going to transform psychically. When we're out of our body, it's much tougher to do the transformation as a soul that we can do in body. That's my reasoning why we have so many people on this planet at this time, is because every soul said, I want to be there and I want to be in a body to do it. My experience psychically is that when you're out of your body, you're waiting for your ancestors who have got a body to do the work. So just to put a little pressure on you, there's a hell of a lot of people who are ancestors waiting for you to make the change because you've got the body that will make it happen. So don't waste the opportunity of waiting till afterwards and think, I wish I had a body. I'm now nobody. Thank you.
Another quite an interesting thing I was briefly mentioned this morning about Polly Higgins. We're talking about the challenges that face Gaia, and we undoubtedly are one of the very big challenges. I agree entirely with Jason that we may not be here anymore, but the planet will. Now, we can, I think, behave better. And as I said this morning, the planet now has a lawyer called Polly Higgins. Now, Polly Higgins runs a website called thisisecocide.com. And at the end of September, I had an email recently that said there's going to be a mock trial in London at the end of September with qualified QCs and everything else to actually put Ecocide on trial. A properly run courtroom scenario where the abuse of the planet, the 10 trillion pounds worth of damage we've done in the last 3 years, is actually going to be publicly discussed by QCs and so on and so forth in a London courtroom. Now, this is quite a nice idea, because if we actually are so intent on buggering the place up, it's about time it stopped. And if this actually went down as a United Nations crime, along with genocide and all the other crimes against humanity, because after all, we are effectively dumping in our own toilet. And this is just ridiculous. So that sort of awareness, which actually says, come on, guys, shape up. We need to behave better. I don't buy the entire carbon business, the Al Gore. This is ridiculous. I think Peter Taylor's take on the whole climate change thing is utterly credible. And as Christine said, the sun is really where it's at. There's an immense amount of power available up there. But we do need to clean up our act. We do need to behave better. And if someone can actually take on Polly Higgins saying, right, I'm going to be the lawyer's planet here, let's clean it up. We have to make a start somewhere. Got to stop the logging, got to stop polluting the sea, got to stop overfishing, all the ludicrous things, and we know they go on, and we roll over for it, because, hey, it's someone else's problem to fix. That time's running out. So I think she deserves, a huge contribution for actually trying on the planet's behalf to say, knock it off, guys. We can't do this anymore, and we really can't do it anymore. Time is running out.
Thank you. Do we have a question on this side now? Thank you.
Questions to the panel. I've been thinking about crop circles, and I'd like to know what your opinion is, whether you've actually got something tangible out of actually studying crop circles. Because one part of me keeps saying, well, they look beautiful. There's definitely some very sophisticated technology behind it, whether it's human or otherwise. But what is the tangible takeaway from these things you see in crop circles? Thank you.
Personally, for me, the tangible, I suppose the most significant tangible thing is the catalyst to change. because it was only through seeing a crop circle in a photograph, not in the flesh even, and that sparked something within me, because I think with so many things, symbol works on a very subconscious, superconscious level, however you want to put it. But the manifestation of that came with the learning process that started and is still ongoing, and hopefully will carry on for however long I'm on the planet and thereafter. So I think tangible is a difficult word in those circumstances because it is a little bit intangible, and that's part of its allure. That if you try and grasp facts about crop circles, if you look for some kind of truth that applies to them, it kind of runs through your fingers like sand, really, because they seem to defy a lot of those boxes that we like to put things in our materialistic Newtonian three-dimensional world. It seems to transcend that, and I think what it does is challenges us to transcend that mentality and that way of thinking by its very quicksilver nature, that it is difficult to sort of get definitive answers. And for me, it's like we were talking about the other night, you know, an appreciation of mystery in the world as well. And I would hate to live in a world where there aren't any mysteries and there aren't any new things to learn. So that's a personal thing for me.
Well, having looked at the astrology of the evolution of crop circles, I mean, what was really fascinating was in 1990, where the whole phenomenon took off. We had the conjunction, as Palden was saying, of the planet Neptune and the planet Uranus. And Uranus is about the new and the, you know, bizarre, if you like, and Neptune is about the mystical. In Capricorn, which is an earth sign, and it's very much about, Capricorn's about very much physical manifestation. And it makes me wonder, because it's sort of following the cycle with the astrology, what's going to happen when transiting Pluto goes over this configuration that happened in the around 1990-91. And the people that were born then as well, because they're carrying that consciousness, and it's going to be in the next few years coming up, and I think they may either disappear or somehow the seed that was planted then is going to come to fruition. And I think it's quite exciting because it very much speaks of spirituality and the new spirituality that I think's coming through, which will be embodied by the generation born at the end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s. And I think, yeah, it will be a different type of spirituality in a way, because of Uranus is about being different. And Capricorn is about being very real. So it's, you know, it could well involve the actual sort of caring more for the earth. This is what I'm sort of fantasizing about. But yeah, I think certainly in the next few years now, we're going to see big changes to do with what the crop circles have represented. There'll be a sort of nexus point.
Well, to answer your question, for me, I've had a major career boost as a result of crop formations, and it's not because of particularly being involved in the crop formation business. But when I was young, I grew up amongst an evolving battle between Catholics and Protestants, and I was beaten up by both sides for not wanting to take sides. And this set me in an inner battle, a jihad. The original meaning of jihad is the inner battle inside of yourself to resolve things, to resolve the contradictions within yourself. And it's gone on for me between archaeology and earth mysteries, and between academic knowledge and knowledge of ETs. and it's gone on as a battle between my intellect and my psychic side. And I think I can rightly say that really the crop formations really helped me let go of my neurotic need for answers, and to be really happy treading a frontier where I couldn't, where I just had to live happily with an evolving process, which might never be resolved. And that's an emotional and psychological dropping, a shedding process of my really programmed Western intellectual need to close it up, to sort it out, to get the answers, to get it explained. And crop circles really gave me advanced therapy on that. And now I'm applying it in the area, in the Holy Land. And for example, I had an instance just a few weeks ago where I met an extreme Israeli right-winger who basically was giving the message of God gave us this land, and therefore, if we don't have this land, we are breaking the word of God. Therefore, the Palestinians must just get out. And he was saying this in 100% totally focused sincerity. And I went just down the hill from Ariel down to the village of Marda, which is literally 200 yards down the hill, to an ancient Arabic village. And there was a man who had fought in the PLFP, which were the guys who used to hijack airplanes and ships in the 1970s and 80s. Muslim extremists, in a manner of speaking, although they were actually socialists. Now, the thing is, I can walk between these two in peace in my heart. It is not a contradiction anymore. So the crop circles have taught me how to reach beyond my own conceptual limitations and to really go out of my depth and feel quite comfortable with that and be able to maintain a certain kind of presence of mind in that so that I can level with these people and both learn from them but also serve them the truth that I can bring to them. And so for me it has been a very definite, quite tangible in the sense that it affects my career because I've redefined, I've increasingly focused my career now on this work in the Middle East, and I would honestly say I think it was the experience of being in the crop formations and going through the fry-ups that we have gone through over the last 20 years, and the consciousness shift which the circle makers have brought to us, and dealing with the real paradoxes which the phenomenon has brought. And that it's not just a paradox out there, it's a paradox in here. And so I would directly attribute that to the crop formations, and it's helping me now in a completely different sphere. So it's job training.
I think, personally, three things. In 1988, I was on my way back from Helsinki, and I lived very near Goodwith Clatford in Hampshire, in a small village, and my neighbour who lived opposite, Graham King, actually runs the Witchcraft Museum in Boscastle that got flooded in the Boscastle floods and so on. And he lived opposite me at the time, and he knocked on my door, and he used to fly a microlight. And he knocked on my door and said, Richard, I was flying over a field in Goodwith Clatford, and my microlight engine conked out, and I crashed, which is bang out of order. Apparently that happened to somebody else in the same field. So we went and had a look at this circle in the corn. This was 1988. So something a little strange. So that really sort of kicked off my interest and my wife and various others. Secondly, you have to conclude that that the great fuss about hoaxing, and I was involved with the CCCS at one time, I was actually very interested to discover what it was that actually caused these things. Because sure as hell, this is quite complicated, and I could not understand for the life of me, with my capitalist hat on in those days, why anybody would want to get up at 2 o'clock in the morning and make these things in the pouring rain for nothing. Didn't add up, didn't make any sense. However you look at them, though, howsoever they appear, this is a method of communication from wherever it is. And if people are making them by hand, it is an attempt to say something to somebody. Even if it's, hey, I did it, be aware that we're doing this for some reason, whatever it is. But the third and the most important thing is people. I wouldn't be sat here in this room now if it wasn't for crop circles. So in other words, there is an aware, open-headed, if you like, or open-minded tribe of people that actually are not prepared just to sit down and take any old shit from any old political party. And I think all of us probably are in this room today because we are sufficiently open-minded that we are prepared to hear and we want to know and we want to keep expanding the horizons to find out just what the hell's going on. Because, as I said this morning, science will explain what's here already. Science is a truth, science is a fact. It's the other things, those 5 elements of philosophy that are so important, and that's logic, ethics, politics, metaphysics, and aesthetics. Those are the things over which we have influence. Science is science. All we do is go dig for the facts, and the facts will present themselves, and what we get is unpeeling the apple all the time. It's there, we just haven't found it yet. So the people, for me, are actually the most important thing. And there are a lot of us, and if we can all get on, and if we can all, if you like, increase the awareness factor to say, hey, come on guys, wake up, then we can start putting some pressure on the idiots that are screwing it all up.
When I started to get involved with the crop formations, the mystery was definitely there, but there was also, it just delighted my curious inner child. It was like, yes, this can't be explained. This is wonderful. And I think that the symbology, and I think, you know, we're surrounded by symbology here. Symbology enters into that deep part of actually of our left brain, but it is going back to that question of why did we forget? It wakes us up to remember. And the word innocence is one of those words that it is only when we're innocent that we can remember. And I like that the fact when you take the word innocent, if you break it down, it says in no sense, which means you have to go out of your mind to be able to get into your inner sense. And I feel that that's what they're doing, is certainly for me, is waking me up to my innocence so I even remember.
Now, incredibly, sadly, we are at the end, but just time, as ever, for a few closing thoughts. So this is your chance, all of you panel, to share with the room something astonishing, or at least something reasonable. So, Jason, you're sitting looking at me, so you can go first to close. A few closing thoughts. Jason, number 1.
No time to think at all, no. I just think we all need to embrace the changes that are coming as much as we possibly can, and with as much love and compassion and empathy for our fellow human beings, and try, though all seems to be falling down around us sometimes, to have fun and joy in our lives, and to keep hold of all those things that make life great, really. And that's about it.
Just going back to the crop circles, one thing that I think is really amazing is if it is something about a new consciousness or even a new spirituality coming through, it certainly appeals to every denomination, and it appears that it appeals to both the more feminine and the more masculine in us. It's sort of pretty much equal. It's like it calls to everybody. There's nobody that is left out or biased in any way if you take the phenomenon as it is. And I think that's pretty incredible. And maybe it's a reflection, like I believe astrology to be as above, so below. Maybe the crop circles are representative of kind of this shift in consciousness, because it's appealing to everybody.
By the way, I've got a key for you, the Danish lady over there. Come and see me afterwards. But in answer to the question, get into the law of paradox, the way that things are not as they appear to be. Some of the greatest humans you will ever meet are terrorists and criminals. Some of the most dangerous humans around here are normal people. This is really true. And try to remember, we settle into these patterns of this is this and that is that. And try to remember to keep churning this up, because all of our normal explanations and assumptions and things like that are all always subject to review. And some of the, I've heard stories of Tony Blair has been referred to a couple of times today, for example. Well, yeah, sure, I agree. But Tony Blair has done some fantastic things in Palestine, and I won't criticize him for it. So even someone who's regarded as an asshole, I'm sorry, still capable of doing some good things. And someone who's looked on as a wonderful person is still capable of making the biggest mistakes. So just remember that. Huh?
Just remember that when you're the caterpillar, you've got all these feet on the ground. You feel your life is really good, but you'd love to be a butterfly. And you could see things so much easier as a butterfly. And we all know that the only way the caterpillar becomes the butterfly is by liquidizing itself down to becoming the cocoon. We're in the process of being liquidized. We can look at it as a drama, a crisis, what's happening to us. But we really need to understand that transformation means death followed by rebirth. And that the death process is not being done to us. We are calling it in. And that when things fall away, we need to say thank you, because I couldn't do it alone without greater help.
Remember that today is pretty much what you can take to the bank. Yesterday and your past history, no point in regretting any of that, because you can't go back and change it. The future is something where you hope, and hope is just that, it's hope. Today is what's really, really important. And if you think that a lot of people have a problem with their personal freedoms being taken away right now, but if you ask the question, why am I free, then you're obviously not. So if you feel in any way enslaved, you're not in chains, you're not bound, but if you feel in any way enslaved in the system, then today is the day, the only time you can actually begin to change that. So to use an old cricketing analogy, as someone said to Don Bradman once, gee, Mr. Bradman, your cricket average of 99.94 was pretty lucky, wasn't it? And he said, yeah, it's a funny thing. The harder I practice, the luckier I get.
Well, before we thank our panel finally, I'd just like to say thank you to you for coming here, sticking with it. If this was your only day with us, thank you for coming. Do come again. If you're coming back for the rest of the weekend, we shall see you hopefully tomorrow, starting at 9:15, I do believe.
Yep.
And then followed soon by me. I'm sorry about that. I would just like to thank also, because, we have pops and crackles on the sound and the projector does funny things. What you don't see is the good guys doing a lot of work to get it all working over there and behind the scenes. Please give them a clap, because they actually did very well. Thank you. So, if Sheila, you don't have any final words, I think one last round of applause, or do you have a final word?
I have nothing to say. Andy?
Jolly good. Well, a final round of applause for everybody then. Thank you.
Bye.